Morgan Freeman follows an employee working double shifts who asks for food to her home. What he saw. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The city never truly slept. Between the neon glow of the billboards and the restless hum of traffic, the night had a pulse of its own. For Olivia Carter, however, nights were an endless blur of fluorescent-lit kitchens, steaming plates, and the ever-present clatter of dishes. She was a waitress at the Golden Spoon, a mid-tier diner where people came for greasy comfort food and bottomless coffee. But for Olivia, it was a battlefield. She had mastered the art of dodging clumsy busboys, balancing plates like a seasoned performer, and smiling even when her body ached with exhaustion. At 29, she had spent the last 6 years in a cycle of double shifts, barely scraping enough to keep the lights on and food in her young son's belly. Each day was a relentless march from exhaustion to duty, yet quitting was never an option. Rent was due, groceries were running low, and Jason, her 6-year-old, was growing faster than her wages could keep up with. Tonight was no different. The orders kept piling in, customers oblivious to her fatigue, her feet screaming for a moment's rest. The only solace was the dim awareness that in a few hours she would finally be able to go home, if home could be called a haven. A one-bedroom apartment in a run-down part of town, where the walls were thin and the heater barely worked. Still, it was better than nothing. When the last of the customers trickled out and the closing duties commenced, Olivia stole a glance at the clock, past midnight. Her stomach grumbled, but eating was the last thing on her mind. She had to get home, check on Jason, and, if luck allowed, steal a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. But tonight, something was different. Something was about to change in a way she could never anticipate. Across the diner, sitting in a quiet corner, a familiar figure observed the scene. He had been there for hours, discreet yet present, blending into the dimly lit ambience. Morgan Freeman had always had an eye for human stories, for the quiet resilience that often went unnoticed. He hadn't come in looking for a spectacle, just a late-night meal and some solitude. But watching Olivia move, seeing the weight of fatigue etched into her every motion, had gripped him in a way he hadn't expected. There was something profoundly human about her struggle, a quiet dignity in the way she carried burdens no one else seemed to acknowledge. When she finally clocked out, reaching for her coat with slow, deliberate movements, something about her posture struck him, the sheer exhaustion of someone who never had the luxury of rest. Morgan didn't need an invitation. Some stories weren't meant to be observed from afar. They demanded action. As Olivia headed toward the back entrance, fumbling with her phone, he overheard her placing an order. Not for herself, but for her son. A single meal. Not much. Just enough to make sure Jason had something warm to eat when she got home. She wasn't expecting anything extravagant, just a simple gesture of survival. The request sent a pang through him. He had seen struggle in many forms, but the quiet sacrifices of everyday people always hit the hardest. It wasn't about charity. It was about seeing, truly seeing. And at that moment, he decided he needed to follow her. Not out of curiosity, but out of a deep, unshakable need to understand what lay beyond the exhausted smile of a woman who worked herself to the bone for a son waiting in the dark. The night air was crisp as Olivia stepped out of the diner, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She adjusted her thin jacket, a flimsy shield against the cold, and pulled out her phone to check the time. 1:13 a.m. Her double shift had stretched longer than expected, but that was nothing new. With aching feet and a mind too weary for thoughts, she started her walk toward the bus stop, barely noticing the lone figure following at a careful distance. Morgan Freeman had moved with the kind of practiced subtlety that came from years of observing people. He wasn't stalking, he was witnessing. There was something profoundly humbling about the way Olivia moved, with silent endurance, carrying burdens that no one seemed to acknowledge. He had watched actors on screen try to capture the essence of struggle, but here was the real thing, unfiltered, raw, and painfully honest. As Olivia reached the corner, she fished a few crumpled bills from her pocket and slipped them into the vending machine near the bus stop. She selected a snack, Not for herself, but for Jason. It was a simple routine, one she had perfected over the years. There were days she came home too late to cook, and Jason would be too tired to wait. So, she always brought something, just enough to ease the hunger, to ensure he wouldn't go to bed with an empty stomach. She wasn't a mother who could afford luxuries, but she was a mother who understood sacrifice. The bus arrived with a loud screech, and Olivia boarded quickly, finding an empty seat near the window. Her head rested against the glass, eyes drifting closed for what she hoped would be a few stolen minutes of rest. Morgan watched her disappear behind the bus doors, a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to follow, but he knew he had to see where she was going. Without hesitation, he hailed a cab and motioned for the driver to follow the bus. He had always believed in the power of stories, the ones hidden in the lives of ordinary people. And tonight he was in the middle of one. The city blurred past as they moved, neon lights casting fleeting reflections inside the cab. Morgan thought about the Olivia Carters of the world, the invisible ones, the ones who held the fabric of society together without ever being acknowledged. They didn't ask for recognition, yet their sacrifices were woven into the very foundation of life itself. The bus came to a halt in a neighborhood that starkly contrasted the vibrant cityscape. The buildings were worn, the streetlights flickering like dying embers. Olivia stepped off, adjusting her bag as she hurried down the sidewalk. Morgan paid the driver and got out, maintaining a careful distance as he followed. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that awaited him. Olivia entered a small, run-down apartment complex, her pace slowing as she reached a door with peeling paint. She hesitated for a moment before unlocking it, stepping inside. Through the dim light spilling out from the hallway, Morgan caught a glimpse of what lay beyond the threshold. A small room with barely any furniture, a thin mattress on the floor, and a tiny figure curled up under a blanket. Jason. He was waiting for her. Even in sleep, his little hands clutched the edges of the blanket, as if holding on to the warmth his mother had struggled so hard to provide. Morgan exhaled, his heart tightening at the silent truth before him. This wasn't just a story of hard work. This was a story of survival, of love in its purest form. And something inside him whispered that he couldn't just walk away. Inside the dimly lit apartment, Olivia let out a slow, exhausted breath. The space was small, barely enough for the essentials: a worn-out couch, a flickering lamp, and a makeshift bed where Jason lay curled up, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. She set her bag down carefully, not wanting to wake him, and unwrapped the snack she had bought at the vending machine. It wasn't much, just a small granola bar, but it was something, a quiet ritual of love. She placed it beside him, knowing that if he woke up hungry, he'd have something to eat. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger had become a familiar companion, one she learned to silence. She was used to making sure Jason had enough before thinking of herself. That was motherhood, it was sacrifice, it was exhaustion, it was love wrapped in silent suffering. Morgan Freeman stood outside, watching the faint glow from the apartment window. The scene before him was not one of pity, but of resilience. He had spent decades portraying characters who fought against life's injustices, but here was a real-life battle, unseen by the world, carried by a woman who never asked for help. He leaned against the cold brick wall of the building, processing what he had just witnessed. Olivia was not just another struggling worker. She was a mother giving everything she had for her child, even at the cost of her own well-being. It wasn't just about poverty. It was about dignity, about a quiet fight that the world often overlooked. He wasn't sure what had pulled him into her story, but he knew, deep in his bones, that he couldn't turn away now. Inside, Olivia sat at the edge of the mattress, running a gentle hand over Jason's curls. He stirred slightly, murmuring in his sleep before settling again. She exhaled, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. But the weight of the world didn't fade. The bills sitting on the small table, the rent due in a few days, the exhaustion that clung to her bones, it all pressed down on her, threatening to drown her. Still, she pushed through. She always did, because there was no other option. She reached for her phone, scrolling through messages, checking for any extra shifts she could pick up. Sleep could wait. Rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. Morgan took a slow breath, making a decision he never thought he'd make. He had seen enough to know that stepping in wasn't about charity. It was about recognition, about lifting someone up who had been carrying too much alone. He wasn't sure how yet, but he knew one thing. Olivia Carter's story deserved to be seen. And somehow, he was going to make sure she knew that she wasn't invisible. Morgan stood outside for a long moment, staring at the quiet apartment. He had never been one to act impulsively, but something about Olivia's reality struck a nerve deep within him. He had seen hardship before, read about it, portrayed it, even supported countless charities to fight against it. But this was different. This was personal. It was raw, immediate, and sitting right in front of him in the form of a mother too exhausted to even eat, a child sleeping on a mattress in a room barely warm enough for comfort. It wasn't just about struggling. It was about the kind of strength that often went unnoticed. The kind of resilience that only those who had lived through hardship could understand. He couldn't just walk away. Inside, Olivia finally allowed herself to lie down, her body sinking into the thin mattress. Sleep was fleeting for her. Never deep, never enough. The weight of responsibility never truly faded, even in the quiet hours of the night. She had long accepted that exhaustion was part of the deal, that sacrifice was the currency she paid to keep her son safe, to keep him fed. But sometimes she wondered if it would ever change, if life would ever stop feeling like an uphill battle with no summit in sight. Her eyes fluttered closed, but just as sleep threatened to take her, a faint knock at the door jolted her back to awareness. Her heart pounded as she sat up. No one ever came this late. Fear flickered in her chest. Was it the landlord again? Had something happened at work? She hesitated, glancing toward Jason, who was still fast asleep. Gathering her composure, she walked to the door, tightening her grip on the handle before cracking it open slightly. And then she froze. Standing outside, illuminated by the dim hallway light, was Morgan Freeman. For a moment, her tired mind struggled to process it. This was impossible. It had to be. But there he was, his face lined with quiet concern, his presence both familiar and surreal. "I'm sorry to bother you." His voice was warm, steady. "But I couldn't just walk away." Olivia's grip tightened on the door, her exhaustion clouding her ability to react. Her throat felt dry. "How?" The question trailed off unfinished. It didn't make sense. Why was he here? Why had he followed her? 100 scenarios ran through her mind, none of them landing on an answer that felt remotely logical. Morgan exhaled, understanding the confusion in her eyes. "I saw you at the diner," he admitted. "I saw how hard you work, how much you give, and I saw something tonight that I couldn't ignore." He paused, his voice carrying an unmistakable sincerity. "I don't want anything from you. He hesitated for the briefest moment. "I just want to help." Silence stretched between them. Olivia's mind raced. This had to be some kind of joke, some kind of misunderstanding. But there was no malice in his eyes, no judgment. Just understanding. Just the quiet recognition of someone who saw past the surface. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of hope. Olivia stood frozen, gripping the edge of the door, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Morgan Freeman, an icon, a man whose voice had narrated stories of resilience and hope, was standing at her doorstep, speaking words that felt both impossible and strangely comforting. Her instincts screamed caution. Life had taught her that nothing came without a price, that kindness was often laced with hidden motives. But looking into his eyes, she saw none of that. There was no pity, no condescension, only sincerity, only understanding. And maybe that was what frightened her the most. "I don't understand," she finally said, her voice hesitant, raw from exhaustion. Why would you care?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying years of disbelief, of being overlooked, of struggling in the shadows without anyone ever noticing. People like her, single mothers barely making it, were invisible to the world. They worked themselves to the bone, sacrificing everything and still, no one stopped to ask if they were okay. And yet, here he was, standing in the cold, offering something she couldn't quite grasp. Morgan took a slow breath, his expression unwavering. "Because I see you," he said simply. "And I know what it's like to fight battles no one else notices." He leaned against the doorframe, his presence calm, steady. "I don't want to intrude. I don't want to make this harder for you. But I also don't want to pretend I didn't see what I saw tonight." He gestured lightly toward the small apartment behind her. "I don't believe in ignoring people who are doing their best with so little." Olivia's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but believing in kindness, in generosity without expectation, felt dangerous. She had learned to rely on herself, to carry her burdens alone. Letting someone in, even just for a moment, meant exposing her struggles, admitting that she needed help. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. "I appreciate the thought, Mr. Freeman, but—" "Morgan," he interrupted gently. "Just Morgan." She exhaled sharply, glancing back at Jason, still fast asleep. Her son, her reason for everything. She had spent years building walls around them, shielding him from the harshness of their reality, from the instability that came with struggling to survive. Letting someone in felt like a risk she couldn't afford. And yet a small, weary part of her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a risk at all. Maybe it was something she had stopped believing in long ago. A chance. She met his gaze again, uncertain, but no longer pushing him away. "What exactly are you offering?" Morgan smiled, a small, knowing smile. "A meal, a conversation, and if you'll let me, maybe something more." He hesitated, then added, "I don't want to fix your life. I just want to remind you that you're not alone in it." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not alone. When was the last time she had felt that? She wasn't sure. But as the cold night pressed in around them, and the weight of exhaustion settled heavier on her shoulders, Olivia made a choice. A small one, but perhaps the most significant in a long time. She stepped back, opening the door just a little wider. "Okay," she murmured. "Come in." Morgan stepped inside cautiously, his presence gentle, as if aware that any sudden movement might shatter Olivia's fragile trust. The apartment was as small as he had expected, barely furnished, its walls marked by years of quiet struggles. The heater hummed faintly, fighting against the cold seeping through the cracks of the old building. A single lamp cast a dim glow, flickering slightly, while in the corner, Jason lay curled under a thin blanket, his peaceful face the only evidence of warmth in the room. Morgan's gaze softened. It wasn't the worst place he had ever seen, but it was a place of survival, not comfort. Olivia closed the door behind him, wrapping her arms around herself as if bracing for whatever came next. She still wasn't sure why she had let him in. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet sincerity in his voice. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the aching loneliness she never admitted to herself. "I don't have much to offer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not even coffee." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "I wasn't expecting company." Morgan smiled, taking a seat on the worn-out couch. "I didn't come for coffee," he said, "and I certainly didn't come to take anything from you." His eyes met hers, steady and warm. "I just wanted to listen." Olivia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeves. She had spent years keeping her struggles to herself, swallowing every hardship without complaint. Talking about it felt foreign, unnecessary. But the way Morgan looked at her, like he actually saw her, like he wasn't just offering empty words, made her chest tighten. She sighed, sinking into the chair across from him. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she admitted. "Life is what it is. I work. I take care of my son. And I do it all over again the next day." Morgan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And when was the last time someone asked how you were doing?" The question caught her off guard. Olivia blinked, her lips parting slightly before closing again. No one ever asked. Not really. People at work made small talk. Customers barely acknowledged her. And even those who knew her struggles only offered vague sympathy before moving on with their lives. No one ever really wanted the answer. "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "Maybe never." Morgan exhaled softly, leaning forward slightly. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone." Olivia let out a shaky laugh. shaking her head. You get used to it. But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure if they were true. Did she really get used to it? Or had she just convinced herself she had no other choice? Morgan studied her for a moment before speaking again. I grew up with nothing, he said, his voice steady. I know what it's like to work twice as hard just to be seen. To wonder if the world even notices the weight on your shoulders. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. But I also know that no one should have to carry everything alone. Olivia swallowed, a lump forming in her throat. She had spent so long convincing herself she was fine, that needing help was a weakness she couldn't afford. But sitting here, in the quiet of her dimly lit apartment, with a man who had no reason to care, yet somehow did, she felt something shift. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. Olivia sat across from Morgan, her fingers unconsciously tracing the hem of her worn sweater. She wasn't sure why she was letting herself be vulnerable with him, but something about his presence made it feel safe. Not safe in the way she had learned to protect herself, by staying guarded, by keeping people at arm's length, but safe in a way she had almost forgotten existed. Safe in being heard, in being seen. Morgan leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his knees. Tell me about him, he said softly, nodding toward Jason's small figure, still curled up beneath the blanket. Your son. A faint smile ghosted across Olivia's lips, despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Jason's my whole world, she murmured. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. He asks questions I don't always have answers for. Her gaze softened as she looked at him, breathing slow and steady in sleep. He loves dinosaurs, knows all their names, even the ones I can't pronounce. Says he wants to be a scientist when he grows up. Morgan smiled. That's a good dream. Olivia nodded, but her expression clouded for a moment. Yeah, I just hope he gets the chance to chase it. Her voice dropped slightly. I work as much as I can, but some days it doesn't feel like enough. Rent's going up again next month. Groceries cost more every time I go to the store. It's like running in quicksand. She let out a breath. And Jason, he doesn't complain, but I know he sees it. He sees when I skip meals. He sees when I come home too tired to do anything but collapse on the couch. I don't want him to think this is what life has to be. Morgan listened intently, the weight of her words settling into his chest. He had heard stories like this before, too many, in fact. But sitting here, in this apartment, seeing it firsthand was different. It wasn't just a story. It was a reality that millions lived through every day, unnoticed, unacknowledged. You're doing more than you realize, he said finally. Just by showing up, by fighting for him, even when it feels like you're losing. Olivia swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to believe that. She really did. But it was hard to see the light when all she had ever known was struggle. She shook her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's not enough, she whispered. I want to give him more. I just don't know how. Morgan hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, neatly folded paper and placed it on the table between them. I don't believe in handouts, he said, his voice gentle but firm. But I do believe in opportunity. Olivia eyed the paper warily, her fingers hovering over it before unfolding it. Her breath hitched slightly as she read the words. A contact, an offer, a chance. She looked up at him, confusion and hesitation battling in her tired eyes. What is this? A fresh start, Morgan said simply. If you want it. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia felt something stir in her chest, something she had nearly forgotten how to feel. Hope. Olivia stared at the paper in her hands, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. It was an address, a name she didn't recognize, and a note scribbled beneath it. They're expecting you. The words sent a ripple of unease through her. She had learned a long time ago that good things didn't just happen, not without consequences. Life had trained her to be wary of kindness, to brace herself for the catch, for the disappointment that always followed. She looked up at Morgan, her fingers tightening around the paper. I don't understand, she said, her voice guarded. What is this? Morgan held her gaze, his expression steady. It's a job opportunity. A real one. Decent hours, better pay. A place where you won't have to kill yourself working double shifts just to get by. He paused. You don't have to take it, Olivia. But I want you to know that you have options. Options. The word felt foreign, almost laughable. People like her didn't have options. They had obligations, responsibilities, burdens they carried alone. The thought of change, of something different, was terrifying. What if she failed? What if this was too good to be true? She had spent so long surviving that the idea of something better felt almost dangerous. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to believe in what he was offering, but the fear of hope, of trusting in something beyond struggle, held her back. Morgan seemed to understand. He leaned forward, his voice softer this time. I met a lot of people in my life, Olivia. People who gave up before they ever had a chance to rise. But you're still fighting, even when the world has given you every reason to stop. He exhaled. You don't have to take my help. You don't even have to trust me. But don't let fear make that choice for you. Olivia swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to breathe. She glanced at Jason, still curled up on the mattress, unaware of the weight of the moment happening just feet away from him. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. Every sacrifice she had made, every sleepless night, every meal skipped, it had all been for him. And if there was even the smallest chance that she could give him something better, didn't she owe it to him to try? Her fingers curled around the paper, gripping it like a lifeline. She wasn't sure if she could do this. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to believe in something better. But maybe, just maybe, she was willing to try. The piece of paper felt heavier than it should, as though it carried more than just an address. It carried possibility, change, and something Olivia wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. She sat in silence, staring at it while her thoughts tangled into knots of doubt. What if this was a mistake? What if it led to another dead end? Worse, what if she failed? She had learned to live within the boundaries of struggle, to navigate exhaustion and disappointment like second nature. But hope? That was unfamiliar territory, and she wasn't sure how to move within it. Morgan seemed to sense her hesitation. He leaned back slightly, his voice steady but kind. I know this is a lot, he said, and I'm not asking you to make a decision tonight. Just think about it. He hesitated for a moment before adding, you deserve more than just survival, Olivia. You and Jason both. Those words struck something deep inside her. She had spent so long scraping by that she had stopped imagining anything beyond making it through the next day. But Jason, her son, deserved more. He deserved stability, warmth, a childhood that wasn't shadowed by struggle. She exhaled, nodding slowly. I'll think about it, she said, though her voice wavered. Morgan smiled. That's all I asked. He stood, adjusting his coat as if sensing it was time to leave. He had done what he came here to do, offered her something more than a fleeting kindness. It was up to her now. He took one last glance at Jason, then turned back to Olivia. No matter what you decide, just know this, you're not invisible. Someone sees you. Olivia's throat tightened, her chest constricting with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Gratitude, fear, a flicker of hope that she was afraid to embrace too quickly. She stood as well, walking him to the door, still struggling with the weight of what had just happened. Thank you, she murmured, barely trusting her own voice. Morgan met her gaze, his eyes warm. No thanks needed, he said. Just promise me one thing. What? If you take the chance, take it for you. Not just for Jason. He smiled slightly. You matter too, Olivia. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time in a long time, someone had told her she mattered. Not just as a mother, not just as a worker struggling through double shifts, but as a person. Morgan stepped into the night, disappearing down the dimly lit hallway. Olivia stood frozen for a long moment before closing the door, pressing her back against it as the weight of everything settled onto her shoulders. She looked down at the paper in her hand, running her fingers over the ink. A choice. A chance. For the first time in years, the future wasn't just a repetition of the past. And for the first time, Olivia allowed herself to imagine something more. Morning came too soon. Olivia woke with a start, the pale light slipping through the threadbare curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. For a moment, she forgot about the previous night, about Morgan Freeman standing in her doorway, about the piece of paper that now sat on the small, cluttered table beside her mattress. But reality came crashing back, and with it, a strange sense of unease. Jason stirred beside her, stretching his small limbs before blinking up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mom," he mumbled, voice thick with sleep. "Are you going to work today?" She hesitated. Normally, the answer would be automatic. Of course, sweetheart. But today was different. Today, she had a choice, and that terrified her. She glanced at the paper, then back at her son. "I don't know yet," she admitted, brushing a gentle hand over his curls. Jason sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You always work," he said simply, as if that was just the way life worked. And for him, he had never known a world where his mother wasn't exhausted, where she wasn't stretching herself thin just to keep them afloat. Olivia swallowed hard. She didn't want that to be the only life he knew. She got up and moved to the small kitchenette, starting the routine she knew by heart, pouring Jason a bowl of cereal, setting his clothes out for the day, brushing aside the worry that sat heavy on her chest. But as she moved, she kept glancing at that paper. The address. The possibility. Could she really do this? She wasn't sure. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to try. By noon, Olivia found herself standing outside the building listed on the paper. It wasn't anything grand, just a small office on the edge of downtown, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. She had almost turned back 3 times on the way there, telling herself it was foolish, that it was too good to be true. But something, maybe Morgan's words, maybe her own buried hope, had kept her walking. She took a breath and stepped inside. The receptionist, a kind-looking woman with short curls and reading glasses, glanced up with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" Olivia hesitated, gripping the strap of her bag. I was told to come here. Someone said there might be a job." Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes, and she nodded. "Ah, you must be Olivia." She gestured toward a small seating area. "You're expected. Have a seat, and someone will be right with you." Olivia nodded slowly and sat down. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clenched them in a fist to stop the shaking. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she had come this far, and maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Olivia sat stiffly in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was simple, clean but unpretentious, just like the opportunity that lay before her. She had spent the entire morning convincing herself to walk through that door, and now that she was here, doubt clawed at her insides. What if she wasn't good enough? What if this was all a mistake? Before her thoughts could spiral further, a door on the far side of the office opened. A tall man in his 50s, dressed in a crisp button-up shirt, stepped out. His face was lined with experience, but softened by kindness. He scanned the room before his gaze landed on her. "Olivia Carter?" he asked. She swallowed hard and stood, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Yes." He extended a hand. "I'm Daniel Pierce. Morgan told me to expect you." Hearing Morgan's name sent a strange wave of reassurance through her. She shook Daniel's hand, her grip firm despite the nerves twisting inside her. He gestured for her to follow him into a modest office, lined with bookshelves and a desk stacked with neatly organized files. "Have a seat," he said, closing the door behind them. Olivia perched on the edge of the chair, her posture tense. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. "I won't waste your time, Olivia. Morgan spoke highly of you. He told me you're hardworking, determined, and capable of more than your current circumstances allow." Olivia's throat tightened. She had never been described like that before. Not as anything more than a waitress, a struggling mother, a woman barely getting by. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "We run a small community outreach program that helps people transition into stable careers. That includes job training, childcare assistance, and financial planning. We have an opening in administration, front desk, scheduling, some organizational work. It's not glamorous, but it pays well, has benefits, and will give you the flexibility to spend more time with your son." Olivia blinked. She hadn't expected this. A real job? Something stable? The idea was almost too overwhelming to process. She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have experience in that kind of work. Daniel smiled. We don't expect you to. What we expect is effort, the willingness to learn. And from what Morgan told me, you've got both. Her chest ached with emotion. For years, she had fought for survival, never daring to believe she could have more. Now, for the first time, someone was offering her a chance. Not out of pity, but because they saw something in her worth investing in. She exhaled shakily. When would I start? Daniel's smile widened. If you're ready Monday. Monday. A new beginning. A new life. Tears burned behind Olivia's eyes, but she blinked them away. She had spent years being strong. She could be strong for just a little longer. Then I'll be here. And just like that, the future she had never allowed herself to imagine was suddenly within reach. The sun had barely risen when Olivia stepped out of her apartment, the crisp morning air biting at her skin. But today the cold didn't feel as harsh. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking toward exhaustion. She was walking toward possibility. Dressed in a simple but neat blouse and slacks she had borrowed from a neighbor, she clutched her bag tightly, nerves humming beneath her skin. She had barely slept the night before, not from worry, but from something she wasn't sure she had ever felt before. Anticipation. Jason sat at the small table, his tiny hands gripping a spoon as he dug into his cereal. He had listened carefully the night before when Olivia told him about her new job, his wide eyes full of questions. Does this mean you won't be so tired all the time? He had asked innocently, and the question had broken something inside her. Now, as she kissed the top of his head before heading for the door, Jason grinned up at her. Good luck, Mom. The words clung to her, warmed her more than any coat ever could. At the office, Olivia took a deep breath before stepping through the doors. The receptionist from before, Julia, greeted her with a welcoming smile. First day jitters? She asked knowingly. Olivia laughed lightly, nodding. Something like that? Don't worry. You'll do great. Julia handed her a folder. Daniel's waiting for you in his office. She walked through the hallway, the weight of uncertainty still lingering, but it no longer paralyzed her. Daniel greeted her with the same steady kindness as before, giving her a rundown of what her tasks would be. Organizing files, scheduling meetings, assisting with community outreach events. It was all new to her, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt something else, determination. By midday, she found herself lost in her work, absorbed in something that wasn't just survival, but purpose. She was learning, adapting, proving to herself that she belonged here. And then, near the end of her shift, a familiar voice pulled her from her focus. You look like you belong here. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. Morgan stood at the doorway, his warm eyes filled with quiet approval. Olivia smiled, shaking her head in disbelief. I don't know what I did to deserve this. Morgan stepped closer. You deserved it before you ever knew it was possible. She exhaled, emotion welling in her chest. Thank you. The words weren't enough, but they were all she had. Morgan nodded, his signature smile lighting up his face. No thanks needed. Just promise me one thing. She raised an eyebrow. Another promise? He chuckled. Just this, never forget that you matter. Not just as a mother, not just as a worker, but as you. The weight of his words settled deep into her soul. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she believed them. She extended a hand, this time not with hesitation, but with confidence. I promise. Morgan shook her hand, giving her one last nod before turning to leave. Olivia watched him go, knowing she would never forget what he had done for her. Not just by giving her an opportunity, but by reminding her that she was more than the struggle. As she turned back to her desk, a quiet smile touched her lips. This was only the beginning. And for the first time in her life, Olivia Carter wasn't just surviving. She was living. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.